Good morning, students, and welcome to the BA Part 2 English Literature class of 2020-21. If you remember from your BA Part 1, Paper 1 last year, the focus was on the Elizabethan period and the Neoclassic period. And we read writers like Edmund Spenser, William Shakespeare, the metaphysical poets John Donne, Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell, a couple of sonnets by the epic poet John Milton, and the neoclassical poets John Dryden and Alexander Pope. We also studied literary terms like sonnet, ode, conceit, lyric, simile, metaphor, alliteration, blank verse, rhythm, heroic couplet, hyperbole, pun, renaissance, restoration, satire, and comedy. We will refer to these and more as we progress with our course this year. In the second year, the focus in the first paper of English poetry and drama is on the pre-romantic and romantic period. And you will be reading the pre-romantic poets like James Thomson, Thomas Gray, William Collins, and William Blake, and the major romantic poets William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats. In the drama section, you have William Shakespeare's tragedy Macbeth, and you will come to know literary terms like tragedy, irony, soliloquy, blank verse, comic relief, elegy, meter, plot, and catharsis. Now your syllabus states the two terms pre-romantic and romantic. Let us first try and understand what we mean by the term pre-romantic. The Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms describes pre-romanticism as a general term applied by modern literary historians to a number of developments in late 18th century culture that are thought to have prepared the ground for Romanticism in its full sense. In various ways, these are all departures from the orderly framework of neoclassicism and its authorized genres and the emergence of new approaches. Throughout the 18th century, all over Europe, signs appeared of new interests and new feelings about neglected elements in life and art. And therefore we find the cult of sensibility in the sentimental novel, the taste for the sublime and the picturesque in landscape, the sensationalism of the early Gothic novels, the melancholy of English graveyard poetry, and the revival of interest in old ballads and romances. These and other developments seem to have helped to give a new importance to subjective and spontaneous individual feeling. Now, the poems prescribed in your course are from the anthology of poems Strings of Gold, edited by Professor Jaspir, who writes in the introduction, and I quote, "The poems in this collection deal with one of the most fertile periods of English poetic imagination, pre-Romanticism and Romanticism. The poetry of the Pre-Romantics belongs to the period of transition from the neoclassical to the Romantic. She further elaborates and says that poems were beginning to be written about childhood memories, about personal emotions, and about death and mortality. Poems were also being written about personal anguish. Thompson's Seasons shifts to the countryside and takes the reader through the descriptions of the changing seasons. The poets move towards reflection from the purely intellectual. Poetry of ideas gives way to poetry of emotions. And we find that two dominant characteristics coexist in the poetry of this age of transition. That is, persistence of some of the conventions and traditions of the classical poetry and the stirrings of a new spirit, a new mode of thought or subject matter and form of expression. And in the 40s of the century began the age of private meditation, not on contemporary men and events, but on universal themes of life and death. The single decade, that is from 1742 to 1751, saw the appearance of Pope's Dunciad, Young's Night Thoughts, Thomson's Castle of Indolence, Gray's Elegy, and the Odes of Collins. This shows that even when the fame of classical poetry in its finest form of elegance and correctness was at its height, the way was being prepared for its final overthrow. Even before Pope, who crystallized the emotional and intellectual attitudes of his age in his poetry, had reached his eminence in the fourth decade of the century, Thompson's Winter, published in 1726, and The Complete Season, published in 1730, had appeared on the scene, thus introducing something new, with the conception of the poet as a recluse living in the country, as a druid playing on his airy harp and meditating among country tombs, as against the traditional idea of the poet as a patron of the London coffee house. During the 25 years from the publication of Thompson's Winter to that of Gray's Elegy in 1751, most of the important works of the poets possessed a new character, somber, stately, and romantic in tone, all showing more or less a vague aspiration towards the study of nature, and not one composed in the heroic couplet. And a large amount of poetry of this period was written in blank verse. So the signs of revolt were noticeable not only in subject matter but in form too. The poets are often conscious of being out of step with the age, of deviating from their predecessors in style and form. And even if they were innovative, they were not imaginative enough. They, however, were the poets who paved the way for Romanticism. And some of the poets that we are going to study, Thomson, Gray, Collins, and Cooper, were influenced by the work of Dryden and Pope. But in their poetry, there's a shift in the subject matter, as also a shift in the treatment. Almost all of them suffered from some kind of melancholia, periods of depression and insanity. This is in itself an indication of the emotional conflict they experienced. The sensibility of the age had changed, but as T.S. Eliot described it, the poets were unable to find a suitable idiom for it. The poetry increasingly became rural and meditative, and at times, as in Cooper's verse, intensely religious and personal. I have already shared a video PPT on pre-romantic poetry, its definition, its features, and the major poets. I hope you will go through that. And this was in brief an introduction to pre-romantic poetry, the changes that took place in the time, and which later resulted in what we know as the Romantic Age, which it's officially said began with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads in 1798. And I would request you to refer to A Good History of English Literature for more details on the pre-Romantic age, and you can also look up the terms online, and I hope that you will continue to make relevant notes. Thank you.